Alani's great-uncle had left her nothing but a sinking inheritance, a dilapidated houseboat tethered to a forgotten stretch of the Blackwater River, where the cypress trees wept Spanish moss into the murky current. For the third time that week, the bilge pump sputtered and died, and the cold, dark water of the river began its silent, patient invasion of the hull, a violation she could feel in the floorboards beneath her worn-out sneakers. It was in that moment, knee-deep in the greasy water of the lowest compartment, wrestling with a corroded pipe under the glare of a failing flashlight, that her hand struck something that was not wood, not steel, but something impossibly dense and smooth and cold. She had just discovered $376 million in gold bullion hidden in the floor of a boat that the river was actively trying to reclaim. If you want to see how one woman's life is about to be changed forever by a secret that's heavier than gold, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, back to the darkness, where a fortune waits at the bottom of a sinking boat. The beam of her flashlight trembled, casting dancing, distorted shadows against the sweating ribs of the hull. The object was a brick or shaped like one, wrapped in oilcloth that was slick with decades of bilge water and grime. It was heavy, unnervingly so. Her exhausted muscles, already screaming from her double shift at the diner and the hours spent trying to keep this wreck afloat, strained to lift it. She dragged it out of the water, the oilcloth peeling away in slimy, disintegrating strips to reveal a dull, buttery gleam that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. It wasn't just a brick. Stamped into its surface were a fineness mark, 9,999, and the name of a Swiss refinery she'd never heard of. Her breath caught in her throat, a dry, rasping sound that was swallowed by the gurgle of the rising water. She swept the flashlight beam across the compartment floor. There, submerged beneath the encroaching river, was another, and another, a perfectly ordered, tightly packed floor of them. A golden mosaic hidden beneath a false bottom she had just broken through. The world outside, with its overdue bills, the landlord's threatening notices, the constant, grinding worry about her son Leo's future, simply ceased to exist. It was replaced by a new reality, one defined by the immense, silent weight of the metal at her feet. This wasn't a handful of coins. This wasn't a lost treasure chest. This was a nation's reserve, a dragon's hoard, an impossible, life-altering, life-threatening secret. The bilge water was now at her shins, cold and insistent, a reminder of the boats, and now her secret's fragility. The river wanted this boat. Every year, she'd been told, the winter rains swelled the Blackwater until it devoured its banks, lifting the houseboats and slamming them against the docks. Elias, her great-uncle, had apparently made a game of it, a strange yearly dance with destruction. But he hadn't told her the floor was paved with gold. He hadn't told her that his legacy was not the rotting wood and rusted fittings, but a weight so immense it was actively pulling his gift to the bottom of the river. A frantic energy seized her. She wasn't thinking about wealth, not yet. She was thinking about loss. The water was rising. She worked with a desperate, clumsy haste, her hands numb from the cold, pulling the bars from their watery vault. Each one was a dead weight, a solid piece of physics that resisted her will. She stacked them on a slightly higher, drier section of the engine housing, their silent gleam a stark contrast to the decay surrounding them. The air was thick with the smell of mold, river mud, and diesel, but beneath it all, she imagined she could smell the gold. A clean, metallic, ancient scent, the smell of power and ruin. She counted them, 42 bars in the first layer she could reach. She probed the darkness with a pry bar, felt it strike more. So many more. A calculation, crude and frantic, flashed through her mind. She'd seen the price of gold on the news tickers, a fantastical number that had no bearing on her life. Until now, a standard bar was 400 troy ounces. The price per ounce? It was a number with too many zeros. Her mind recoiled from the sum. It was an abstraction, a concept as alien as the surface of the moon. More real was the burn in her shoulders and the terror in her heart. This much gold didn't just exist. It had a history, a history that had led it to the bilge of a sinking boat owned by a reclusive old man who talked to river birds. And now that history was hers. The flashlight flickered again, a dying star in her small, dark universe. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the awe. She was alone, in the dark, in a sinking boat, standing on a fortune that could get her killed. Outside, the night was silent save for the lapping of water against the hull. But it was a deceptive silence. In that moment, she felt as if the entire world was listening, holding its breath, waiting for her to make a move. The weight of the gold was nothing compared to the weight of the secret that now settled upon her, a pressure far greater than the dark water rising around her ankles. She had to get Leo. She had to get him away from their cramped apartment, away from the life of scarcity she had fought so hard to shield him from. But where could they go? Who could she tell? The questions circled like vultures. Every person she knew, every institution she had ever dealt with, the bank, the police, the government, suddenly seemed like a potential threat, a predator drawn to the scent of this impossible wealth. Her life as a struggling single mother was over. A new life had begun, one of a keeper of a secret so vast it threatened to consume her before she could even understand it. The boat groaned, a deep, resonant sound of stressed wood and metal, as if protesting the weight it had carried for so long. It was sinking, and it was taking the secret with it. Or perhaps, she thought with a sudden, chilling clarity, it was the secret that was sinking the boat. The dawn broke gray and uncertain, filtering through the grimy portholes of the houseboat and casting long, dusty shadows over the cabin. Alani had not slept. She sat at the small, wobbly galley table, a single gold bar resting in front of her. In the faint morning light, it seemed less real, more like a prop from a movie. But its weight was undeniable, a solid anchor of reality in a sea of disbelief. She had spent the night in a state of hypervigilant panic, moving a dozen of the bars from the bilge to a more secure, drier locker hidden beneath a seat cushion in the main cabin. Each trip up and down the narrow ladder was a torment of fear, her ears straining for any sound from the shore, footsteps on the dock, the crunch of gravel, the distant rumble of a car engine. The world had transformed overnight. Every shadow held a threat. Every stranger's glance felt like an interrogation. Her son, Leo, was still asleep in the small bunk, his face peaceful and innocent, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. His presence was both her greatest comfort and her most profound terror. This gold could give him everything she had ever dreamed of. A safe home, a good school, a future without the constant, gnawing anxiety of poverty. Or it could destroy them both. It was a poison apple, gleaming and perfect and deadly. She had to understand where it came from. Her great-uncle Elias had been the family ghost, a man who had drifted away from everyone decades ago, choosing the solitude of the river over the company of his relatives. They spoke of him in hushed, pitying tones. The eccentric, the hermit, the man who'd lost his way. He sent cryptic postcards once or twice a year, filled with observations about river currents and the migratory patterns of herons, but never a word about himself. He had been, by all accounts, a poor man. He lived on a pittance of a pension and whatever he could catch from the river. So where did a poor man get a king's ransom? Alani started to search the boat, not for more gold, but for answers. She moved with a new, deliberate slowness, seeing the space not as a burden to be repaired, but as a puzzle to be solved. Elias had left everything in a state of organized chaos. Charts of the river lined one wall, covered in his spidery handwriting, noting depths and snags and eddies. Books were everywhere, stacked in precarious towers, histories of the region, manuals on boat engines, collections of poetry. It was the library of a man with a deep and specific curiosity. In a drawer filled with rusted tools and tangled fishing line, she found a small, leather-bound ledger. It wasn't a financial record, not in the traditional sense. There were no columns of numbers, no debits or credits. Instead, there were dates going back nearly 50 years, and next to each date a single cryptic entry. The weight is steady. The river remembers what the land forgets, she groans tonight. She knows her purpose, a visitor from the Sterling Foundation. Sent him away with a story about Catfish Sterling Foundation. The name meant nothing to her, but Elias had written it with a heavier, more deliberate stroke, the ink slightly blurring the page as if from pressure. It was a clue. She ran her fingers over the embossed cover of the ledger. It felt like a direct connection to the man she barely knew, a whisper from the past. The boat itself was a part of him, a floating archive of his life. The worn patch on the floor where he must have sat, the faint smell of his pipe tobacco still clinging to the curtains, the carefully repaired fishing net draped over a chair. He hadn't been a simple hermit. He had been a guardian, a keeper. The thought settled on her with the same cold weight as the gold. He hadn't been hiding the gold for himself. He had been protecting it. But from whom? And for what? A floorboard creaked behind her. Alani spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, her hand instinctively reaching for a heavy wrench on the counter. It was just Leo, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his small form silhouetted against the morning light. "Mom? The floor is wet," he said, his voice small and drowsy. He was right. A small puddle was spreading out from the base of the wall. The temporary patch she'd made on the pipe in the bilge had failed. The river was still coming in. The boat was still sinking. The reality of her situation came crashing back in. She had a fortune that could buy a private island, but she couldn't afford a real plumber. She was the richest poor woman in the world, trapped on a floating wreck with a secret that was pulling her under. "It's okay, sweetie," she said, her voice strained. "It's just the old boat." It groans a little. She looked from her son's trusting face to the gold bar on the table, then to the encroaching water on the floor. The ledger's words echoed in her mind. "The weight is steady." Elias hadn't just been talking about the gold. He had been talking about the responsibility. A responsibility that was now hers. She felt a profound sense of isolation, a feeling of being adrift on a vast, dark ocean. She was the sole guardian of a mystery she didn't understand, pursued by threats she couldn't yet see, all while the very ground beneath her feet was slowly, inexorably giving way. The silence of the morning was broken by the sound of a car engine, much closer this time, pulling into the gravel lot at the head of the dock. Alani froze, her body rigid with a new and unfamiliar fear. They were coming. She didn't know who they were, but she knew, with an instinct she couldn't explain, that they were coming for the secret. The car that pulled into the gravel lot was a sleek, black sedan, the kind that looked utterly alien against the backdrop of rust-pocked pickup trucks and the general decay of the marina. It sat there for a long moment, its tinted windows reflecting the gray sky, an omen of polished, expensive trouble. Alani's heart hammered against her ribs. She quickly grabbed the gold bar from the table, her hands clumsy with adrenaline, and shoved it back into the locker, piling cushions on top of it. She pulled Leo close, her mind racing. Run? Where? Hide? The boat was a trap, a floating coffin. She had to stay, to pretend everything was normal. A man emerged from the driver's side. He was tall, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed impervious to the damp river air. He moved with a languid, confident grace, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel as he walked towards the dock, his eyes scanning the row of houseboats. He wasn't looking around, he was searching. His gaze settled on Elias's boat, on her boat, and he began to walk down the rickety wooden pier. Alani smoothed her frayed sweater, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the cockpit, trying to project an air of weary ownership, of someone who belonged there. "Can I help you?" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. The man stopped a few feet from the boat. He smiled, a thin, practiced expression that didn't reach his cold, analytical eyes. "Good morning. I hope I'm not disturbing you. My name is Julian Croft. I'm with the Sterling Heritage Foundation. I was an acquaintance of the late Mr. Thorne. I only just heard of his passing and wanted to offer my condolences to his next of kin. Sterling Heritage Foundation." The name from the ledger. A jolt went through Alani, a cold shock of confirmation. This was not a condolence call. "Thank you," she said, keeping her voice level. "I'm his great-niece, Alani." "A pleasure, Alani," Croft said. his eyes flicking over the boat, taking in the peeling paint, the sagging railings, the general state of disrepair. It was a dismissive, appraising glance, the look of a man pricing an asset. Elias was a unique individual. He had a deep connection to the history of this river. Our foundation works to preserve that history. In fact, we had many long conversations, your great-uncle and I, about his collection. His collection. Alani feigned ignorance, her mind screaming. I wasn't aware he had one. Just a lot of old books and fishing gear. Croft's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Oh, Elias was very modest. But he was a historian in his own way. He had a particular interest in artifacts from the mid-19th century. Specifically, from the Freehaven settlement that used to be located just upriver from here. A fascinating, if tragic, piece of local history. Did he ever speak of it? No, Alani said, the lie feeling heavy and clumsy on her tongue. He didn't talk much about the past. A shame, Croft murmured, his gaze lingering on the hull, near the waterline. We at the Foundation believe he may have come into possession of certain items of historical significance from that period. Items the Foundation is extremely keen to acquire, for preservation, of course. We would be prepared to offer a very generous price for the boat and all its contents, to save you the trouble of dealing with all this. He gestured vaguely at the boat. A gesture that encompassed not just the decay but her entire life. It was an offer and a threat, wrapped in the language of polite concern. He was probing, testing her. He didn't know for sure that she'd found it, but he suspected. Elias had warned him away, and now he was back to test the new owner. I'm not looking to sell, Alani said, her resolve hardening. It was my uncle's. I plan on fixing it up. A flicker of annoyance crossed Croft's face before being replaced by the same smooth mask. I understand. Sentimental value is important. But this is a significant undertaking. This boat, it has a reputation. It floods, sinks a little lower every winter. It would be a tragedy if anything of historical value were to be lost to the river. He let the words hang in the air, a thinly veiled warning. He was telling her he knew the boat's weakness. He knew it was a race against time. He handed her a crisp, white business card. Well, if you change your mind, please don't hesitate to call. The Foundation is very motivated. We believe some things are too important to be left to chance. He gave her one last, searching look, then turned and walked back down the dock, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Alani watched until the black sedan pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. She sank onto a bench, her legs trembling. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it had drained her completely. They knew, or they suspected enough to be dangerous. The Sterling Foundation wasn't a historical society. It was a hunter, and it had been stalking her great-uncle for years. Now it was stalking her. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit here and wait for Croft to come back. The first step was to confirm what she had, to turn the abstract idea of wealth into something tangible. That evening, after putting a very quiet and subdued Leo to bed, she undertook the most terrifying task of her life. She chose the smallest of the bars she'd brought up from the bilge. She wrapped it in old towels, placed it in a canvas grocery bag, and put it in the trunk of her beat-up car. Every step from the boat to the car felt like walking through a minefield. Every rustle of leaves, every distant dog bark, sent a fresh wave of paranoia through her. She drove for an hour to a different town, to a pawn shop in a rundown strip mall with a flickering neon sign that promised cash for gold. The man behind the counter was old and rheumy-eyed, with a magnifying glass permanently attached to his spectacles. He looked at her, then at the heavy bag, with an air of profound boredom. "What V you got?" he grunted. Her hands shook as she unwrapped the bar and placed it on the counter. The thud it made seemed to shake the entire building. The pawnbroker's boredom evaporated. He stared at the bar, then at her, his eyes wide. He picked it up, testing its weight, his professional skepticism warring with pure astonishment. He ran a scanner over it, scratched a tiny, invisible flake onto a testing stone, and applied a drop of acid. He did all of this in complete, reverent silence. Finally, he looked up at her, his expression a mixture of awe and fear. "Lady," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "where in God's name did you get this?" The question hung in the stale air of the shop, the one question she could never, ever answer. She had her confirmation. The gold was real, and now someone else knew. The pawnbroker's terrified awe was a new kind of confirmation, more visceral than any spot price on a screen. Alani had left the shop without selling, mumbling an excuse about it being a family heirloom she just wanted appraised. The man had watched her go, his face pale, as if he'd seen a ghost. She knew he wouldn't call the police. A man in his profession knew better than to invite official scrutiny. But he would remember. He was a loose thread, a witness to the impossible. The drive back to the marina was a blur of paranoia. The headlights of every car behind her seemed to belong to Julian Croft's black sedan. She felt exposed, marked. The weight of the single gold bar in her trunk felt like it was warping the frame of the car, pulling her off the road. She needed help. Not the kind of help you could call the police for, but the kind that understood secrets and the long, dark shadows of history. Elias's ledger was her only guide. She scanned the pages again, her fingers tracing his cryptic notes. Most were about the river, but a few mentioned people always by a single initial. A. Stopped by. He remembers the old stories. He knows what Sterling's grandfather did. A. Brought maps. The old ones. Before the dam, before the new channel. The river's memory is longer than theirs. A. Mr. Abernathy. She found the full name on a faded envelope tucked into the back of the ledger, containing a yellowed newspaper clipping about a local historian fighting to preserve records from the old county courthouse. The address was for a small cottage on the other side of the river, miles from the marina. Finding him was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. The next day, she left Leo with a neighbor she trusted, inventing a story about a job interview. The lie tasted like ash, the beginning of a new, necessary duplicity. Mr. Abernathy's cottage was exactly as she'd imagined. A small, cluttered house sinking under the weight of books and maps, set back from a quiet road and smelling faintly of pipe smoke and decaying paper. An old man with a cloud of white hair and eyes that seemed to hold the patience of the river itself answered the door. He looked at her, and a flicker of recognition, or perhaps something deeper, crossed his face. "You have his eyes," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't ask who he was. He knew. "You're Alani." He stepped aside and gestured for her to enter.
"I'm Abernathy."
"I've been wondering when you'd show up." The inside of the cottage was a labyrinth of paper. Books overflowed from shelves, maps were pinned to every wall, and stacks of documents covered every flat surface. It was the den of a man obsessed with the past. Abernathy cleared a pile of books from a worn armchair and motioned for her to sit. "Elias told me he was leaving the boat to you," he said, settling into a chair opposite her. "He said you were strong, stronger than you knew. Looks like you're about to find out if he was right, Mr. Abernathy." Alani began, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to understand. My uncle. The boat." She didn't know how to say it. How do you ask about a fortune that shouldn't exist? Abernathy saved her the trouble. "It's not about the boat, is it, child? It's about the ballast." He looked at her pointedly, and in his gaze, she found not judgment, but a deep, weary understanding. "He never told me what it was, not in so many words." Elias was a man who understood that some things are safer when they aren't spoken aloud. "But he told me what it represented. He called it the debt." Alani leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. "A debt to who?" "To the river," Abernathy said, his voice dropping. "To the people the river remembers. Have you ever heard of a town called Freehaven?" It was the name Croft had mentioned. He said, "The man from the Sterling Foundation said my uncle was interested in it." Abernathy's expression darkened at the mention of the name. "Julian Croft." "Yes. His great-grandfather, Tiberius Sterling, is the man who built the railroad. The man who destroyed Freehaven to do it." He rose slowly and unpinned a large, hand-drawn map from the wall. It showed the river as it was in the 1860s. He pointed to a spot that was now nothing but swampland. Right here, Freehaven wasn't just a town. It was a promise. Founded by freedmen after the war, a community built on shared labor and fierce independence. They were successful. Too successful. They owned the land. They controlled a key ferry crossing. They were in the way of Tiberius Sterling's progress. He told her the story, his voice a low, somber cadence. Sterling had tried to buy the land, but the people of Freehaven refused to sell their dream. So he used power, money, and lawmen to invent a crisis, a land dispute backed by manufactured documents. He broke them, drove them from their homes, and flooded the valley to build his railway bridge, literally wiping the town off the map. But some of them knew what was coming, Abernathy continued, his finger tracing a line on the map. They pooled their resources, everything they had. They converted it into something dense, something permanent, something that could be hidden. They entrusted it to one man, a river pilot, with instructions to keep it safe until a day came when it could be used to rebuild, to restore what was stolen. That river pilot was Elias Thorne's great-grandfather. Alani stared at the map, at the ghost of a town. The gold wasn't a treasure. It was a trust. It was the collected hope and sacrifice of an entire community, waiting for justice. And the river pilot's family, they've been guarding it ever since? She whispered, passing it down. A secret inheritance, Abernathy confirmed. Elias was the latest in the line. He saw himself not as an owner, but as a custodian, a librarian of history's heaviest book. And he knew the Sterlings never gave up looking for it. They see it as a loose end, a family asset that got away. Their foundation is just a tool, a way to hunt for it under the guise of preservation. Suddenly, the weight in the hull of the boat had a new dimension. It was not just the weight of gold, but the weight of souls, of a promise made over a century ago. Elias hadn't been a crazy hermit. He had been a sentinel, living a life of deliberate poverty and solitude to protect a sacred trust. And he had chosen her to be the next one. Why me? She asked, the question filled with doubt and fear. He hardly knew me. He knew your struggle, Abernathy said gently. He knew you understood what it was to fight for every inch. He knew you valued your son's future more than anything. He believed you wouldn't be corrupted by the gold, but would see the value it represented. He trusted you to understand that some treasures are responsibilities. Abernathy walked to a heavy oak chest in the corner and unlocked it. He pulled out a thick oilcloth-wrapped parcel and handed it to her. It was heavy. Inside was not gold, but another ledger, older than the first, and a set of intricate hand-drawn diagrams. This was the pilot's log, Abernathy said. It contains the original charter for Freehaven, the names of the founding families, and his sworn testimony of what Sterling did. It is the proof. The other diagrams. Elias was working on something. Plan. He knew the boat wouldn't last forever. He knew the river would eventually claim it. He intended to use that. To use the river's own power to reveal the secret at the right time. Alani looked down at the documents, at the elegant, faded script. She was holding the heart of the story. The truth. The gold was the means, but this was the purpose. She had come here seeking answers, and she had found a mission. A mission that pitted her, a single mother in a sinking houseboat, against the vast generational power of the Sterling family. The fear was still there, but now, for the first time, it was joined by something else. A flicker of righteous, defiant fire. Returning to the houseboat that evening felt different. The familiar scent of damp wood and river water was no longer the smell of decay, but of history. The boat was not just a failing structure. It was a vault, a sanctuary that had held its secret for generations. Alani spread the contents of the oilcloth parcel on the galley table under the dim light of a battery-powered lantern. The pilot's log was a revelation, page after page of meticulous, heartbreaking detail. The names of the families who had contributed, the exact amounts they had given. Some a lifetime of savings, others a wedding ring, a silver locket. All melted down and recast into the anonymous, uniform bars that now lay silent in her hull. It was a litany of hope, a testament to a community's desperate bid for survival. Accompanying the log were the diagrams Abernathy had mentioned. They were technical drawings of the houseboat itself, but with modifications Alani had never noticed. Elias, it turned out, had not just been patching holes and nursing a dying engine. He had been re-engineering his inheritance. He had reinforced the compartment where the gold was stored, turning it into a massively strong, watertight container. But he had also installed a series of carefully designed release mechanisms, connected to hydrostatic triggers. It was a plan of incredible ingenuity and risk. Elias had intended to use the annual flood. He planned to let the river lift the boat, carry it to a specific predetermined location downstream, and then, at a precise moment, trigger the releases, allowing the entire reinforced vault, the gold, the proof, the legacy of Freehaven, to separate from the failing hull and settle onto the riverbed, to be discovered in a place where its story could not be denied. It was a message in a bottle on a scale she could barely comprehend. It was also terrifyingly incomplete. Elias's notes trailed off, his handwriting growing weaker in the final pages. He had run out of time. He had built the vessel for his message, but he hadn't been able to launch it. That task, she now understood, was left to her. The responsibility was crushing. She was no engineer, no historian, no strategist. She was a waitress who knew how to stretch a dollar until it screamed. How could she possibly pull off something so complex, so dangerous? For the next several days, she lived a double life. By day, she was mom, making breakfast for Leo, walking him to the school bus, her face a mask of calm reassurance. She took time off from the diner, telling her boss it was a family emergency, which was the truest lie she had ever told. But by night, she became Elias's student, his successor. She studied the diagrams, cross-referencing them with the boat's actual structure, tracing wiring and hydraulic lines he had hidden behind panels and under floorboards. She read the pilot's log over and over, memorizing the names of the families, trying to feel the weight of their sacrifice. The gold was no longer an abstraction of wealth. It had a face, a story. It was Sarah May's silver comb, Joseph's savings for a new plot of land, the christening cup of a child who would be forced to flee. This transformation within her was profound. The initial, frantic desire to snatch the gold and run, to disappear and give Leo a life of anonymous luxury, began to fade. That felt like a different kind of theft now. It would be a betrayal of the trust that had been passed down through a century of silence and sacrifice. It would be an insult to the memory of Freehaven. Her struggle was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. But the threat of Julian Croft and the Sterling Foundation loomed. She felt their presence even when they were nowhere to be seen. A strange car parked for too long at the end of the road. A fisherman who seemed more interested in her boat than in his line. These could be coincidences, products of her heightened paranoia, or they could be surveillance. She felt like a mouse being watched by a patient hawk. She knew she couldn't move all the gold. It was too much, too heavy. Even if she could, where would she take it? Any attempt to move that much bullion would attract exactly the kind of attention she had to avoid. Elias's plan, as insane as it seemed, was the only way. The boat had to be the delivery system. The river had to be the witness. She began to work, her hands raw, her muscles aching. She used the small stash of cash she had saved to buy the tools and parts she needed, paying in cash at different hardware stores in towns miles apart. She learned to solder, to read a hydraulic pressure gauge, to reinforce a weld. The boat became her world. Its groans and creaks were a language she was learning to understand. She was no longer just trying to keep it from sinking. She was preparing it for its final, most important voyage. One afternoon, while she was working in the bilge, her hands covered in grease, Leo came down the ladder. He had been quiet and withdrawn for days, watching his mother with worried eyes. "Are we going to sink, Mom?" he asked, his small voice echoing in the cramped space. Alani stopped what she was doing and looked at her son, truly looked at him. She saw the fear in his eyes, the reflection of her own anxiety. She had been trying to shield him from the secret, but in doing so, she had isolated them both. She sat down on a support beam and patted the space next to her.
No, esuetie.
We're not going to sink, she said, choosing her words carefully. This boat, it's very special. Your great-great-great-grandfather built something amazing into it. Promise. And we're going to help him keep it. She didn't tell him about the gold, not directly. But she told him the story of Freehaven. She told him about a brave community that had saved its dream in a secret chest, and how their family had been chosen to protect it. She framed it as a grand adventure, a sacred duty. Leo's eyes, which had been filled with fear, now lit up with wonder. A secret chest? Like pirates? Sort of. Alani smiled, a genuine smile for the first time in what felt like an eternity. But we're not the pirates. We're the guardians of the treasure in that moment. Sharing a piece of the truth with her son, she felt a shift. She was no longer just Alani, the frightened woman who had stumbled upon a fortune. She was Alani Thorne, the next link in the chain, a guardian. And she was not alone. She had the ghosts of Freehaven, the memory of Elias, the wisdom of Abernathy, and the unwavering trust of her son. The weight was still immense, but it was no longer a burden that would sink her. It was ballast. It was purpose. The pressure from the Sterling Foundation escalated from subtle surveillance to overt intimidation. One morning, Alani found a notice tacked to her door, a crisp legal document from the county citing a litany of code violations. Improper mooring, unpermitted repairs, sanitation issues. It was a clear attempt to use bureaucracy as a weapon, to entangle her in red tape and force her off the river. The document listed a compliance date just 4 weeks away, a deadline that felt less like a legal formality and more like a countdown. Julian Croft was tightening the net. A few days later, a more direct message arrived. She returned from a supply run to find the boat's thick mooring line sawed halfway through, a deliberate act of sabotage that, had she not noticed it, could have sent the houseboat drifting into the main channel during the next storm. There was no note, no explanation needed. It was a clear signal: we can get to you. We can sink you. The fear for Leo's safety became a constant, sickening hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. She began walking him all the way to the bus stop and waiting until the bus was out of sight, her eyes scanning every car, every pedestrian. She installed new locks on the cabin door and wedged a chair beneath the handle at night. The houseboat, once a sanctuary of secrets, now felt like a fragile, vulnerable cage. The temptation to abandon Elias's grand plan and simply run became overwhelming. One night, unable to sleep, she sat in the dark cabin, the pilot's log open in her lap. She could take 10 bars, maybe 20. It would be more money than she could spend in 100 lifetimes. They could disappear, new names, new lives, a beachfront house somewhere far away from the dark water of the river. Leo would be safe. He would have everything. She held the thought in her mind, letting its seductive comfort wash over her. Safety, security, an end to the fear. But as she looked at the names in the log, the ghosts of Freehaven seemed to rise from the page. They had entrusted their entire world to her family. They had faced down men like Tiberius Sterling and chosen defiance over safety. Elias had lived a life of lonely, impoverished vigilance to honor their choice. If she ran, their sacrifice would mean nothing. The story would be lost, the debt unpaid. Julian Croft and the Sterling Foundation would win. They would rewrite history, calling the people of Freehaven squatters and their legacy a lost family asset. And the world would believe them because the truth would be buried in the vault of a Swiss bank. The moral crossroads was clear, a stark choice in the darkness of the cabin. She could save her son's future, or she could honor the past of hundreds of souls. The terrible, beautiful realization that dawned on her was that they were the same thing. What kind of future would she be giving Leo if she taught him that the right response to injustice was to run and hide? What kind of wealth was it if it was built on a foundation of betrayal? She closed the log. The decision was made. She would not run. She would fight. She would see Elias's plan through. This realization shifted her entire approach. She was no longer just defending. She was preparing to attack. Her work on the boat took on a new urgency, a new focus. She wasn't just repairing. She was setting a trap. Elias's plan was brilliant, but it was passive. It relied on the discovery of the vault after the fact. Alani decided it needed to be more. The revelation had to be an event. It had to be undeniable, public, and it had to happen in a way that exposed the Sterling Foundation for what it was. She called Mr. Abernathy. "They're pushing," she said, her voice low and tight, speaking on a cheap burner phone she'd bought. "Legal notices, sabotage. They're trying to force me out before the floods. They know the season is turning." Abernathy's voice crackled back. "The river is their enemy as much as it is our ally. They need to get their hands on the boat before it can become a vessel of truth." "Elias's plan was to let the vault sink and be found," Alani said. "I don't think that's enough. Croft will just claim it, bury the story in legal challenges for years. I need to expose them. I need a witness." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What do you have in mind, child?" "The annual River Heritage Festival," Alani said, the idea taking shape even as she spoke it. "It's in 3 weeks. The weekend the floodwaters are predicted to be at their peak. The whole town is there. The local news crews, everyone. They do a parade of lights with all the boats on the river. It's a spectacle," Abernathy said, a note of understanding in his voice. "Noisy, crowded. The perfect place to hide in plain sight. And the perfect stage," Alani added. "If I can get the boat there, into the middle of the parade. If the accident happens then, in front of everyone." The audacity of the plan was terrifying. It was a high-wire act with no safety net. Everything would have to work perfectly. The floodwaters, the boat's hidden mechanisms, the timing. A dozen things could go wrong, each one ending in disaster. She could be arrested, the gold could be lost forever, or worse, Croft and his people could intercept her. "It's dangerous, Alani," Abernathy warned, his voice grave. "They will be watching. They'll expect you to make a move as the floods rise." "I know," she said, her gaze falling on Leo, who was sleeping peacefully in his bunk, oblivious to the dangerous currents his mother was navigating. "But I also know that the most dangerous thing I can do right now is nothing in that moment." Alani ceased to be a victim of her inheritance. She became its agent. She was no longer just protecting the legacy. She was preparing to wield it as a weapon. She would turn the Sterling Foundation's own tactics against them. They wanted to use the law, public perception, and intimidation to get what they wanted. She would use the truth, the spectacle of the festival, and the undeniable, shocking reality of a fortune in gold appearing at the bottom of the river, broadcast on the evening news. The sinking houseboat was no longer a liability. It was a Trojan horse, and she was about to sail it into the heart of the enemy's territory. The choice had been made. There was no turning back. The river was rising, and a storm of history was about to break. The 3 weeks leading up to the River Heritage Festival were a blur of frantic, clandestine activity. Alani worked with a feverish intensity, fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and the unshakable conviction of her decision. The houseboat became a cocoon of purpose, a place where the past was being meticulously wired to explode into the present. She finalized the modifications to the release mechanism, following Elias's diagrams with an apprentice's devotion. She tested the hydrostatic triggers in a bucket of water, her heart pounding as the small latches clicked open with precision. She waterproofed the pilot's log and the other documents from Freehaven, sealing them in a watertight container that she secured inside the gold vault. The proof had to survive the journey to the riverbed. Mr. Abernathy became her lifeline to the outside world, her spymaster and quartermaster. He used his network of local historians and river rats to gather information. He learned that the Sterling Heritage Foundation had made a significant donation to the festival, securing themselves a VIP tent and a prominent speaking slot for Julian Croft. They were positioning themselves to be the official historical authority on site, ready to frame any discovery to their advantage. "They're not just waiting for you to make a mistake, Alani," Abernathy had warned her over the burner phone. "They're setting the stage to control the narrative, no matter what happens." He also helped her acquire the last, crucial pieces of her plan. A set of small, powerful, waterproof transponders. A remotely operated underwater camera, the kind used by marine biologists. A high-capacity battery pack. These were not in Elias's original design. They were Alani's additions. She wasn't just going to sink the vault. She was going to broadcast its discovery to the world in real time. Her plan was twofold. Phase 1 was the delivery. She had to navigate the increasingly unstable houseboat several miles downriver, in the dark, in the middle of a chaotic boat parade, without attracting the attention of Croft's men. Phase 2 was the revelation. At the precise moment, she would trigger the release, sending the vault to the bottom. But simultaneously, the transponders would activate, broadcasting a signal to a public webpage Abernathy was setting up. The underwater camera, attached to the vault itself, would begin streaming its descent and its resting place on the riverbed, surrounded by a fortune in gold bars. The webpage would also contain high-resolution scans of every page of the pilot's log, the names of the Freehaven families, and Abernathy's meticulously researched history of Tiberius Sterling's crimes. When the vault was discovered, the truth would already be out there, an unretractable digital bombshell. The days ticked by. The river began to swell, its muddy water creeping higher up the banks, just as the old-timers predicted. The air grew heavy and damp. A sense of inevitability settled over the marina. Alani worked on the boat's failing engine, coaxing it back to a semblance of life. Coughed and sputtered, but it ran. It only needed to run for a few more hours. Leo was her silent partner in the endeavor. He helped her test wires, handed her tools, and acted as her lookout. He understood the gravity of their mission in the way only a child can, grasping the fairy tale elements of justice and secret treasure. His unwavering belief in her became her anchor. "Are the guardians of the treasure going to win, Mom?" he asked one evening, as they watched the river inch closer to the top of the dock. "Yes, sweetie," she said, pulling him close. "The guardians always win." Eventually, the night before the festival, Julian Croft made his final move. It wasn't a direct assault. It was something more insidious. A man from Child Protective Services showed up, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy. They had received an anonymous tip, they said, about an endangered child living in unsafe conditions on a derelict houseboat. The accusation was a knife to Alani's heart. Croft was trying to take Leo away from her, to use her greatest love as leverage. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, her body a shield, and spoke with a calm, cold fury she didn't know she possessed. She explained that the boat was temporary housing, that she was a loving mother, that they were preparing to move. The CPS worker, a tired-looking woman, seemed skeptical but followed procedure, her eyes taking in the patched walls and the damp floor. But Leo, with the simple, profound wisdom of a child who knows he is loved, saved them. He spoke to the woman not about the boat's flaws, but about the stories his mom told him, about the project they were working on together. He showed her his drawings of Freehaven, a town of brave people with a secret. He radiated a sense of safety and love that no anonymous tip could tarnish. The CPS worker left, promising to file a report, but without the urgency the tipster had likely intended. The threat was neutralized, for now. But the attack left Alani shaken to her core. Croft would stop at nothing. He saw her not as a person, but as an obstacle. Her son was just a tool to be used. The last vestiges of her fear were burned away, replaced by a diamond-hard resolve. This wasn't just about historical justice anymore. It was personal. That night, under the cover of a moonless, overcast sky, the plan was set in motion. The floodwaters had lifted the houseboat, making it bob lightly on its strained moorings. The river was high and fast. The time had come. Alani looked at her son. "Ready for an adventure?" she asked. Leo nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "For Freehaven," he whispered. Alani cut the last of the sabotaged mooring lines. The old engine sputtered to life. Slowly, silently, the sinking inheritance pulled away from the dock, leaving the quiet, forgotten marina behind. It turned its bow downstream, a ghost ship on a dark river, heading towards a parade of lights and a final, explosive reckoning with the past. The journey downriver was a voyage through a dreamscape of shadows and distorted reflections. The flood had transformed the landscape, swallowing the familiar banks and creating a vast, dark lake where forests had been. Alani stood at the helm, her knuckles white as she gripped the worn wooden wheel. The boat, heavy with its secret ballast, handled sluggishly, fighting the pull of the unusually strong current. Every floating log was a potential disaster, every dark shape on the water a possible enemy. Leo stood beside her, his small hand holding onto her belt, his eyes scanning the darkness. He was her co-pilot, her lookout, her brave son. Abernathy's voice crackled intermittently over a small handheld radio, a lifeline in the oppressive darkness. Weather report shows the front holding. The peak surge should hit in about an hour, he'd say, or no unusual chatter on the marine channels. You're still a ghost. As they neared the town, the night sky began to glow with an artificial dawn. The sounds of the festival drifted towards them across the water. The distant thump of music, the murmur of a large crowd, the cheerful horns of other boats. They were approaching the edge of the world they were about to shatter. Alani steered the houseboat towards a less trafficked tributary, a marshy inlet shielded by a stand of cypress trees, a staging point she and Abernathy had identified on the old maps. From here, she could see the parade route clearly. A string of brightly lit boats, yachts, pontoons, fishing boats, all draped in festive lights, moved in a slow, glittering procession. It was a scene of idyllic community celebration, utterly oblivious to the historical drama about to unfold in its midst. On the shore, she could just make out the VIP tent Abernathy had described. It was larger and more brightly lit than the others, a beacon of corporate power. Julian Croft was in there, waiting, confident that he had all the angles covered. The thought sent a surge of cold determination through her. She checked the systems one last time. The remote camera was active, sending a grainy, dark feed to her phone, which was connected to Abernathy's server. The release mechanism was armed. The transponders were dormant, waiting for her signal. She knelt down and looked Leo in the eye. "Okay, buddy. This is it. Mr. Abernathy is waiting for you at the old boat launch, just around this bend. I need you to be very brave and get on his boat, okay? I'll be right behind you." Panic flickered in his eyes. "You're not coming with me?" "Not right away," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I have to park this boat first. It's the most important part. I will meet you on the shore." I promise. It was the hardest lie she had ever told, because there was no guarantee she could keep that promise. She hugged him tightly, breathing in the scent of his hair, trying to memorize the feel of his small arms around her neck. This was why she was doing it, for the future his hug represented. Abernathy's small, dark skiff appeared out of the shadows, its motor barely a whisper. The transfer was quick, silent, and wrenching. Alani watched the skiff disappear back into the darkness, a piece of her soul going with it. Now she was truly alone. She took a deep breath and nudged the houseboat out of the inlet, merging into the tail end of the parade. To the other boaters, she must have been a strange sight. A dark, unlit, dilapidated houseboat amidst the gaudy celebration. A few people pointed, some laughed. She was the ghost at the feast. She steered the boat towards the center of the channel, directly in front of the shoreline where the main festivities were centered. She could see the news cameras on their tripods, their red lights glowing. She was in position. The current was strong here, pulling at the hull. The boat groaned, a deep, final protest. The bilge pumps had long since failed, and the water was rising fast. It was no longer a matter of if it would sink, but when. She opened the seacocks in the engine room, a final, irreversible act. The gurgle of the invading river was deafening now. The boat began to list slowly at first, then with alarming speed. People on the shore and in nearby boats started to notice. Shouts of alarm cut through the festive music. A spotlight from the shore swung over and found her, trapping her in its bright, accusatory glare. This was the moment. With her thumb, she pressed the sequence of buttons on the remote detonator. In the hull beneath her, a series of dull, metallic clunks echoed, the sound of Elias's mechanism firing. The massive, reinforced vault, containing the hope of Freehaven and the weight of history, detached from the dying frame of the houseboat. The boat, suddenly freed of its immense ballast, lurched upwards, seeming to leap out of the water before it began to break apart, its structural integrity gone. On her phone, Alani saw the camera feed flicker to life. It showed the dark, swirling water as the vault descended, the gleam of gold bars visible in the camera's small light. At the same time, she hit the second button, activating the transponders. Abernathy's webpage went live. The story of Freehaven, in all its damning detail, was now broadcasting to the world. The houseboat was disintegrating around her. Alarms were blaring from the patrol boats. She had to go. She climbed onto the railing, the spotlight blinding her, and jumped into the cold, dark water of the river. The shock of the cold was breathtaking, but she forced herself to swim, moving away from the wreck and towards the dark shoreline, away from the chaos she had unleashed. As she swam, she glanced back. The remains of the houseboat were sinking fast. The parade was in disarray. And on the shore, she saw a figure standing outside the VIP tent, illuminated by the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. It was Julian Croft. He was not looking at the wreck. He was staring straight out at the water, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. He was looking for her. She had not just sunk a boat. She had sunk his world. The river, the keeper of secrets, had finally given up its dead, and it had done so on a stage so bright that no one could ever look away. The aftermath was a maelstrom of flashing lights, screaming sirens, and bewildered reporters. Alani dragged herself from the river onto a muddy, secluded part of the bank, shivering from cold and adrenaline. She watched from the shadows as rescue boats converged on the spot where the houseboat had gone down, their searchlights crisscrossing the dark water. On the shore, the festival had devolved into chaos. The music was cut, replaced by the urgent chatter of official radios and the panicked murmur of the crowd. She saw Julian Croft, surrounded by several grim-faced men, barking into a phone, his handsome face contorted with fury. He knew he had been outmaneuvered, his prize snatched from his grasp and simultaneously exposed to the entire world. The trap had been sprung. Abernathy found her in the darkness, wrapping her in a thick, dry blanket. Leo was with him, his eyes wide but his face etched with a fierce pride. He ran to her, and she held him, the tremors in her body slowly subsiding. "You did it, Mom," he whispered into her shoulder. "You kept the promise?" "We did it," she corrected him, her voice hoarse. They watched for a few more minutes as a news van with a satellite dish on its roof screeched to a halt. A reporter, microphone in hand, was already speaking breathlessly, gesturing towards the river. Alani could just make out the words on the wind. Unconfirmed reports, a historic discovery. A website called The Freehaven Debt is claiming. The narrative was already taking hold, faster than Croft could possibly contain it. Abernathy's digital bombshell had struck its target. By the time the authorities sent down the first ROV to investigate the navigation hazard left by the wreck, thousands of people had already seen the live feed from Alani's camera, showing the vault, the gold, and the clear, undeniable proof of a massive, undeclared treasure. They had read the pilot's log. They had seen the names. The story of Freehaven was being resurrected, line by line, on screens across the country. The next few days were a blur. Alani, represented by a pro bono legal team Abernathy had arranged months in advance, turned herself in. She was not arrested, but held as a material witness. She gave her statement, calmly and clearly, telling the story not of gold, but of a legacy. She presented the original documents, which Abernathy had delivered to the State Attorney General's office the moment the vault was confirmed. The Sterling Heritage Foundation was thrown into a desperate damage control mode. Julian Croft gave a press conference, dismissing the entire event as a hoax, a stunt by a deranged woman. He claimed the so-called gold was fake, the documents forgeries, and that his great-grandfather was a benevolent industrialist being slandered by revisionist history. But his denials rang hollow. The evidence was too overwhelming, too public. The state was forced to begin a formal salvage operation, and every step was scrutinized by a legion of reporters and amateur historians who had become obsessed with the story. When the first gold bar was brought to the surface on live television and authenticated by federal experts, the Sterling Foundation's credibility collapsed. The story exploded. It was a modern myth. The single mother, the sinking houseboat, the secret history, the stolen dream of a lost town. Descendants of the Freehaven families, scattered across the country for generations, began to emerge, their old family stories suddenly validated. The names in the pilot's log were matched to genealogical records. The debt was no longer an abstract concept. It had living, breathing heirs. The legal battle was immense, a tangled war waged by armies of lawyers. The Sterling Corporation's stock plummeted. Federal investigators began looking into the foundation's finances, uncovering a long history of aggressive, unethical, and potentially illegal actions in its hunt for the Freehaven gold. Julian Croft was undone not by the gold itself, but by the crimes he had committed to get it. The conspiracy, the intimidation, the attempted sabotage. Alani was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing. The state declared the vault and its contents a unique historical and cultural artifact. A special trust was established by the courts, administered by a board that included descendants of the Freehaven families and respected historians, including a very pleased Mr. Abernathy. The gold was not to be liquidated and distributed as cash. Instead, its value would be used to fund the Freehaven Legacy Foundation, a permanent institution dedicated to providing educational scholarships, small business grants, and community development funds for the descendants of the original families and for other marginalized communities in the region. The debt would be paid not as a one-time settlement, but as a perpetual engine of restoration and opportunity. Alani did not become a multimillionaire. She had never wanted to be. The trust provided her and Leo with a modest but secure stipend, enough to live comfortably, to have a safe home. A small, sturdy house on a quiet street with no leaks, and for Leo to go to any college he chose. They were not fabulously wealthy, but they were free. Free from the grinding poverty that had defined Alani's life, and free from the crushing weight of the secret. 1 year after the night of the festival, Alani stood with Leo and Mr. Abernathy on a hill overlooking the river. Below, construction had begun on a new museum and cultural center, the first project of the Freehaven Legacy Foundation. It was being built on land the foundation had acquired, land that had once belonged to Tiberius Sterling. Elias would have liked this, Abernathy said, his voice thick with emotion. He always said the river never forgets. He just needed someone brave enough to translate. Alani looked at the river, calm and steady now, its surface glittering in the afternoon sun. It was no longer a source of fear or a symbol of her sinking life. It was a witness, an ally, a force of nature that had helped her carry a promise to its final destination. She had inherited a sinking boat, a burden that was meant to pull her under. But she had discovered that its true inheritance was not the gold, but the story. The weight had not been a curse, but a ballast, giving her the stability and purpose to navigate the storm and deliver a lost history back into the light. She took Leo's hand, her heart full. They were not rich, not in the way the world measured such things. They were something far more valuable. They were guardians who had successfully kept their trust, the final link in a chain of honor that had stretched across more than a century. Their legacy was not one of gold, but of justice delivered, of a story told, of a promise finally, blessedly, kept.